You know, it's pretty easy to take something like voting for granted, to think it's just always been there. But what if it wasn't? Today, we're going to dive into the story of the Chartist movement, an incredible fight by ordinary people for the democratic rights that we all have today.
I mean, just stop and think about that. What if your boss could see exactly who you voted for? Or imagine if you had to own a bunch of land just to have a chance at running for office. These weren't just thought experiments. They were real problems, and they sparked one of the biggest movements in British history.
Okay, so to really get why people were so fired up, we have to travel back in time to Britain in the 1830s. The country was right in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, which was a time of massive, world-changing technology. But for the vast majority of working-class folks, life was really, really tough. So what was fueling all this frustration? Well, for starters, a huge new law called the Great Reform Act had just passed. It gave more middle-class people the right to vote, but it completely left out the working class. They still couldn't vote. At the same time, in these new, overcrowded industrial cities, wages were super low and the living conditions were often just awful, dirty and unhealthy. And the real kicker? They had zero say in the government that was making the laws that ran their entire lives.
So they looked at all these different problems and came to one simple, powerful conclusion. The only way to really fix things, to get better pay, cleaner streets, a better life, was to get political power. And they knew the key to that power was getting the right to vote.
So in 1838, they put it all down on paper. They created a document that would become legendary, the People's Charter. And this charter laid out 6 crystal-clear demands that they believed would completely transform the country for the better.
And these 6 points became a massive rallying cry. So let's break them down. First, a vote for every single man over the age of 21. Second, a secret ballot, so nobody could bully you into voting their way. Third, they said you shouldn't have to own property to become a member of parliament or an MP. Fourth, MPs should actually get paid, so working people could afford to do the job. Fifth, all voting districts should be equal in size. And finally, they wanted elections every single year to keep politicians on their toes. A couple of these were especially groundbreaking.
The first point, what we call universal suffrage, was a seriously radical idea back then. It meant that your right to have a say in your country's future shouldn't depend on how much money you had in the bank. It was about the principle that every adult man deserved a voice.
And the secret ballot? Just as important. See, before this, voting was often a public affair. You literally had to stand up and say who you were voting for. That meant your landlord or your boss could easily punish you if they didn't like your choice. The secret ballot was all about protecting people and making sure their vote was truly their own.
Now, millions of people were on board with the charter, but, and this is a big but, they didn't all agree on the best way to make it happen. This split can really be seen in their 2 most famous leaders, who had totally different ideas about how to win. On one side, you had William Lovett. His strategy was called moral force. You can think of it as the peaceful persuasion approach. He argued that the working class should use education, pamphlets, and peaceful protests to prove they were responsible enough for the vote. But on the other side, you had Fergus O'Connor, a really passionate speaker who was all about physical force. His was the pressure approach. He organized huge rallies to show off their numbers and wasn't afraid to warn the government that if their demands were ignored, things could get violent.
All right, so with these 2 different strategies buzzing around, the Chartists got to work. Their first big move was to show Parliament just how many people were standing behind them.
They put together a massive petition in 1839. And get this, they collected nearly 1.3 million signatures. To put that in perspective, the entire population of London at the time was barely over 2 million. This thing was so huge it had to be wheeled into Parliament on a giant cart. It was a powerful symbol of the people's will.
So what did Parliament do with this incredible display of public opinion? They didn't even bother to debate it. They just voted to reject it, flat out. For the hundreds of thousands of people who had poured their hopes into this petition, the disappointment was crushing, and it turned to anger fast.
That anger boiled over. Just a few months later, about 10,000 workers marched in Newport, Wales. It turned violent, and soldiers ended up firing on the crowd, killing several protesters. But the Chartists were not done. They came back with a second, even bigger petition in 1842, and then a final one in 1848, a year when revolutions were kicking off all over Europe. The stakes were getting higher.
And the support just kept growing. That second petition, which they presented during a really bad economic depression, had over 3.3 million signatures. I mean, that is an absolutely astonishing number for the time. It showed the movement was more powerful and more determined than ever. But, once again, Parliament rejected it. And this time, the response was a massive wave of strikes all across the country. Workers famously pulled the plugs out of the steam boilers in factories, literally shutting down industry. These became known as the plug plot riots.
Their last big push was in 1848. They planned a huge rally in London, but the government was terrified of a revolution and basically flooded the city with police. The petition was delivered, but it ended in disaster. Officials went through it and claimed it was full of fake signatures. They said they found names like Queen Victoria and even a famous puppet named Mr. Punch. This was a huge embarrassment, and it really damaged the movement's reputation, marking the beginning of the end for Chartism.
So it sounds like a complete and total failure, right? They never got their charter passed, the movement fell apart, but that is not the whole story. To see their real legacy, we have to look past the immediate defeats.
Because even though they lost the battle in the short term, in many ways, they absolutely won the war. The Chartist movement was like a giant training ground for democracy. For the first time, an entire generation of working people learned how to organize, how to hold meetings, how to publish newspapers, and how to fight for a political cause they believed in.
And what about those 6 demands they fought so hard for? Well, just look at this. Over the next few decades, 5 of them actually became law. The right to vote was extended to all men. The secret ballot was introduced. You no longer had to own property to be an MP. MPs started getting paid, and voting districts were made more equal. The only one that never happened was having elections every single year. Not bad, right?
When you step back, Chartism was a true game changer. It's remembered as the first mass political movement in modern history that was led by and for working-class people. Their ideas didn't just vanish. They planted the seeds for the democracy that would eventually grow.
The rights we have today, like the right to vote, they weren't just given to us. They were fought for by ordinary people who believed in a better, fairer society. The Chartists organized. They marched, they protested, and they demanded to be heard. They fought for their voice. Which leaves us with a pretty good question to think about. How will we use ours?